Conversation, and on that optimistic note, bringing in one angle which has been spoken about a lot over the last 2 days and a few of the sessions in the morning. As we speak of digitization, technology, impact measurement, one lens overriding all of this is that of gender inclusivity. How can investors bring in a gender angle into their investment thesis? How can measurement be made more robust to bring in these aspects? Is a conversation with which we have been hearing increasingly over the last few months. And to shed some light on this, we'll be getting into our new panel, which speaks about the gender lens opportunities in India. Glad to invite our speakers on stage. Jyotsna Krishnan, Managing Partner, Elevar Equity and co-founder NMAS. Rajat Arora, Principal Investment Officer and Head of Asia, Women's World Banking Asset Management. Rajneesh Kadambar, Executive Director and Head ESG, Eversource Capital. Sarita Raichura, Director Bloom Ventures. Shalaka Joshi, Gender Lead South Asia, International Finance Corporation. And Ragini Pillai, Executive at Gender and Diversity Finance with the British International Investment, who will be moderating this session. As we get into this, we would like to extend our gratitude to the BII team for their support towards this session. Over to you, Ragini.
Good morning, everyone. So we've got together a very diverse group of investors today, many different sectors, capital across the capital spectrum. And we're going to have a very future-focused conversation on the opportunities for deepening and scaling gender lens investing in India. So this morning, and also yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about definitions, and we've been talking about defining impact a fair bit. So I'd like to take a leaf out of that same book. We've been talking about gender lens, gender smart for a few years now, and even for the past couple of days. So I'd really like to start by defining what that means. There isn't actually an industry body that has specifically defined it that I know of. So we'll hear from all of the investors today, how they think about it. And maybe this can be a bit of a rapid fire, so a really brief one-liner on what gender smart means to you and how you in your organization apply that gender smart lens. Maybe I'll start with you, Jyotsna.
Thanks. The discussions yesterday were also interesting, and as I think about it, investing requires a really strong worldview. And having diversity of thinking is absolutely critical to that worldview, and gender diversity is one such aspect. I actually think there are two dimensions to this. One is a dimension that plays out in a slightly more formal world, which is amongst investors, the boardrooms we occupy, the senior management, founders we back. And the other side of gender lens is really a massive population in the informal markets, which is really our target customer segment from an impact standpoint. I think the former, which is the formal side of gender lens, is an important challenge. It requires constant challenging of unconscious biases and a culture that leads you to diversity as against measurements or policies, right? There is a culture that sets up women for success. That is an important challenge to tackle, and it takes constant effort. On the informal side, I actually think the story is extremely inspiring and the place I go to learn what the potential of women is. And I think we'll talk more about that as we see. I mean, right from the time women started engaging in economic activity through microfinance to more recently when I've seen some of the emergence of the first women-led farmer producer organizations where women in rural India are forming boards and CEOs of businesses with crores of turnover. That journey is absolutely fascinating, and I think we should talk about that as well.
Hi. So first of all, I think if an example of diversity has to be given, I think this panel itself is a great one. Answering your question, Ragini, in a sense you mentioned, or asked rather, gender smart. So in my mind, I think smartness comes from data. And therefore the gender smartness also comes with respect to the kind of data or gender disaggregate data that one can measure. And that's what we really focus on. Because to be smart in terms of implementing any gender strategies or making an organization drive, we first need information. Basis that information, need to identify a certain baseline, identify gaps, and not only measure those, but also make that data actionable, make them into actionable insights, have right tools available at their disposal to influence the boards, the management teams, And that's where, or all of these is something that we integrate into our investment strategy, which essentially translates into two things. For us, Gender Lens is about one, the customer acquisition strategy, and if you are a provider of choice in the market for women, then you are a provider of choice for pretty much everybody. So if you go after women, you go after everybody. Second is, if you're an employer of choice for women, then you are an employer of choice for everybody. So which translates into our talent acquisition strategy. But going back to my previous point, I think all of that in terms of being gender smart is dependent on the type of data that you capture.
Hey, thank you IIC for hosting us. And on gender smart, right, I think we think first starts with intent. I think where there is intent, there will always be processes and stuff in place. So when we look at gender smart, we look at the right intent and measurably look at moving capital towards creating more gender diversity. So we start at home with our team and conscious effort over the last 5 years to get our team to about 44% women. Does that mean, is it at the leadership level as well? Not yet, but we're trying, consciously creating sheets and following folks and saying, okay, how are we going to get more folks in, right? More women in. And that, with that intent, and when you see that, it automatically trickles down. So we start looking at boards, we look, whenever we are investing in somebody, not intentionally saying, hey, they have to be women founders or co-founders, but do they have an intent to ensure that there is diversity in their leadership teams, there's diversity across the pool. If you're having even larger teams, can you make sure that you have a good ratio, right? That's what we're looking for. So I think it's starting with intent, and that's where we're hoping we'll get progress as we go.
Thanks, and great question, Ragini. I think the definition of gender smart is evolving. I mean, it's been nascent for a while, and several of us have been working in it for a long time. But as a space that is growing in terms of how much capital is going there, it's relatively new. So I think we land on a definition when there's actually more capital that identifies itself as gender smart, right? So at the IFC, I think that we focus on maybe the smart element of it, because as investors, all of us are sort of duty bound to be connected to our returns, right? And so we really see it as the business case for gender is obvious. There's a lot of growth that is possible both on the finance side as well as on the development side, and we're a development finance institution. So we focus quite a bit, I would say, on the smart business, not just kind of good to have, but almost necessary to have for the growth of your investments. And I'd say we use maybe several lenses towards it. So we've heard a little bit about employees, we've heard a little bit about consumers. We also focus quite a bit on community stakeholders in certain markets. It varies depending on the sector and the market that we operate in, but it's very much integrated into the core business that we operate in, right? So we work on gender across all our investment areas. I think last year we had about 67% of our investments in South Asia, which is the region that I lead, had a significant gender element. Looking forward to sharing more examples of that, but I think the bottom line for me and for the IFC is that it is smart business. It's a missed opportunity if you're not looking at it, and so you're actually missing out on both the financial returns, but also the development impact that you can have.
Thanks, Ragini. Being a part of the private equity space, especially as a climate-focused fund, I am more of a nuts and bolts guy. So when it comes to defining gender smart, I would like to borrow more in terms of picking up the SMART acronym itself. For me, it's kind of more a fit-for-purpose approach that we try to adopt. Reason being, we are into emerging sectors where the challenges are of a different kind altogether, where the nascent industry is still kind of grappling with how do you kind of mainstream gender-related activities as part of the main operations. So if I have to pick up, it will be more in terms of specific and relevant. Those are the two terms that I start with when we talk about having a gender lens and trying to make it a kind of all-encompassing activity across the portfolios. When I'm talking portfolios ranging right from industrial decarbonization, renewable energy, as well as e-mobility. All these sectors have different kind of challenges. So how do we kind of approach each one And first of all, in the given context, how good a listener are we to understand the gender smart approach itself? Because everybody comes with a very preconceived approach. Gender strategy is something we have done it before. We have got an action plan, but looking beyond that, on ground, how does it operate? So that is where out of the smart, I'll start with specific and relevant to each portfolio, kind of business that we are into. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So I think we've got many different strands here, and I would say the definition would land somewhere in a mix of everything. So we've heard intent, data, representation, linking it ultimately to the commercial case or the business case, and also making it really, really contextual. So ultimately, hoping the definition lands somewhere in the middle of all of these things, it really comes down to how do you actually translate that definition into practice. So as investors, how do we actually take this into our entire investment life cycle? So maybe let's start with the beginning and origination at that. So yesterday we had a conversation with several of you in the room on gender lens investing, and one of the things we heard quite resoundingly is, well, when we're thinking about investing with the lens of investing in female founders or gender balanced teams, putting more capital into the hands of enterprises led and run by women, we often encounter a pipeline issue. Now I really want to delve into this pipeline issue and ask you, and maybe I'll start with you, Sarita, how have you adapted your sourcing strategy to ensure that you attract the talent out there, so female founders, gender balanced teams, and are really helping mobilize that capital? What have you done differently, and where have you looked? And how has that actually resulted in a better sourcing strategy for Bloom?
Sure. So, like I said, I think there is a systemic issue, right, across when you look at women in STEM, or you see the ratios across, right? But from our perspective, once we decided that there is intent, once we ensured our team has diversity, we said, now let's look at what are our ratios, right? So Fund 3, we're today on Fund 4. Fund 3, we had 10% women co-founders, women in leadership. We said, can we gradually increase that, right? How do we do that? So we ran a program called Lead Tribe, which was, we interviewed a lot of women founders, we got them into a cohort, we got them to go through this whole program of meeting mentors, mentorship, what is fundraising, how do we get product market fit, connect them to the right folks. And from that cohort, whether we invested or somebody else invested, we made sure these founders became more investable. So ultimately, at the end, when we measured Fund 4, we're almost at the end of Fund 4, we're at 15%. 15% women co-founders as part of the entire. It's not great, but at least we're happy to see that there's improvement. So I think consciously ensuring, and wherever there is an invite, if there are women founders, women entrepreneurs, we make sure somebody from the team is going there. Because I think at some point you started with paid forward, but eventually you can see the numbers. You can, as you measure, you'll see. And what's also happening, not just at leadership, what we're seeing with our companies like KaleidoFin, be it Apna Club, once there's a woman on top or at the leadership level, automatically not just their team, but even at the grassroots level. So if Apna Club has Shruti leading it, what we're seeing is in all of their warehouses in Tier 2, Tier 3, they have women there. So we're seeing that trickle-down effect happening, but it's slow, it's not as fast as we would like it to be.
Actually, on the investing thesis side, I mean, my mind always thinks bottom up, so I'll have to start from the bottom in some sense. Right at the beginning, I mean, for me, the first moment of truth on removing my bias on what women are capable of happened in 1999 when I met a few rural women in Jhansi. And I just fell in love with the entrepreneurial spirit out there, right? When you actually realize the power that is held there and is somewhat locked up and caged because of historical constructs that exist, that's when you realize that removing biases and working with that segment can really unlock potential. And it's as simple as that, and simple things are often tough as well, right? Because you have to challenge yourself on a daily basis. That time spent with women on the ground led us to realize that way beyond microfinance, if you think about the economic decision making that happens in households, if you really spend time on the ground, you realize that there is a massive shift that has already taken place in the last 20 years. Women are very active when it comes to economic decisions, and that is where revenue pools for a lot of investing thesis is coming from. I still remember the first priority for women was setting aside money for affordable English medium education for their children, and that is really what has resulted in the spends that have happened on education-related companies. Similarly, if you think about healthcare as a thesis, you think about agriculture where women are very active, you think about MSMEs, women actually end up spending and importantly contributing to the economics of a household. And when you realize that kernel and what's happening on the ground now, I don't think any of us have a choice but to consciously factor in the thinking, the decision-making, and the mindset of women, right? As you go into the formal world, I think that's the challenge I feel even at Elevar. We're 2/3 women-owned, women-run, women partnership, women leadership, all of that. And it happened as an outcome of an environment that constantly questions historical biases, right? And when you try and remove that bias, you naturally set up a ground for women to flourish professionally and personally. And this is where, I guess, when it comes to founders, we've realized that founders are also happy to engage. We naturally attract people when they see you as people who have somewhat made progress in developing a culture that is genuinely focused on diversity and welcoming an unbiased approach, right? I think it's very tough to achieve that. It takes a fair amount of work and constant challenging. And it's not just women. Like, just because I myself have been found myself guilty of holding those biases, and I need to be questioned also by people around me, because it just comes naturally to all of us. Allowing for those biases to be set aside is the secret. I don't think there's anything we can formulaically apply, but it's great to actually look back at some of these things and to use the measures that are available, be it the 2X challenge and all of these measures, to just see, it's like your scorecard, right? Have you created an environment that removes the bias to allow women to enter your system and flourish? If the answer is yes, we'll do well on all these measures. And I think that's the way we've approached things to ensure there's authenticity to the whole approach, yeah.
No, I think that's very interesting, and two very different approaches. So one is through a very structured program saying this is something that we're going to go out to the market with, and that is going to really be our pipeline, and hopefully some of those flow through the main fund, but a demonstration effect is also other investors investing in them. And then the other approach is very much softer and saying, well, this is something we're going to test with every investment. We're going to test culture, and we're going to make sure that's part of our overall approach to looking at any company. And that might not actually be specific metrics. It might be a combination of metrics and conversations. So some very different approaches, and that's quite interesting to see play out. I want to come to you next, Shalaka, and I guess IFC invests both in intermediaries and also directs. Well, assuming, and let's take for a second granted that, okay, there might be a pipeline issue and we're all trying to solve it in different ways. There is then this opportunity for structuring deals to actually meet the outcomes we wanted to ultimately meet. So having, for example, gender-linked incentives in place. BII has dabbled with this a little bit with interest rate ratchets, linking carried interest payable to gender KPIs. We know IFC has done a lot of this across different products as well. What has been your experience on effectiveness of these kinds of deal structures? Have they actually led to the outcomes we hoped they'd lead to? Are there any successes you'd like to share, or even lessons learned if things didn't go as planned?
Good question and tough question. I think we're still learning. So what I'll do is maybe share 2 quick examples and 1 key insight. And I'll pick examples outside of India because I think there's actually more for us to learn from them in some ways. So we invested in an early stage VC fund that's focused on tech businesses in Pakistan. It's called Sarmaya Kar. It was a $2 million investment, but we also brought in 0.5 million of consensual finance. And the reason we brought that in is because when we were talking to the fund about gender-focused outcomes as a condition of the investment, the fund was like, it's too risky, right? So what can we do to offset the risk is the approach that we took. And it seems to have worked in that they had a pipeline issue, just connecting it to what you both said earlier, which was their pipeline baseline was at 10% of women-owned, women-led, or women-focused, consumer-oriented portfolio companies. And then as a result of the concessional finance, there was a whole approach that went in. They were able to, I think, hire more dedicated talent to de-risk some of these investments into a little bit of capacity building. And so then the pipeline moved from 10% to 42% in kind of the first year and a half. So I'd say that's a good outcome. I mean, there's more to do always, but it's a nice story to indicate how sometimes you need to bring in that concessional finance, especially in early stage or in a market that's maybe not as sophisticated. The second example I'll share is at a different scale. It's from Indonesia, and it was a $201 million investment that we made in OCBC. It's a large financial player. The approach there was to say, look, as investors, we are asking you to focus in on outcomes that are gender and climate, right? So the deal was structured in a way where you had a $100 million gender bond over 5 years, and then you had a $100 million climate-focused bond, like a green bond, also over 5 years. But again, we brought in concessional finance of about 1.25 million, right? So, and the approach there was that the gender financing would go to women-owned SMEs, and the green bond would go towards maybe more green project financing, particularly around green mortgages. I think the key insight here from both these examples was actually the concessional finance piece, like just connecting it to the fireside chat that happened before this. The catalytic nature of blended finance cannot be underestimated no matter what market you're in. So we found that that's been really helpful in driving the outcomes that we're seeking. And you need those examples, I think, to really create then more of a sector-wide approach and a sector-wide change. So we found that to be kind of uniquely successful. The other piece that we've thought is working well is actually from India, where it's around maybe creating more conversations and more of the ecosystem approach, which you were talking about earlier, right? Like, how do we really internalize the biases that we all have and work as a sector towards them? So we have something called the India Gender Collaborative. It's a collaboration between IFC, ILO, World Bank, UN Women, and about 50 of the largest private sector players in the country, all on gender equality. So it's like a 12-month program that's working through some of these pieces and actually does include quite a heavy focus on things like structuring for financial institutions, things like, I mean, it goes beyond gender, right? It's also economic inclusion, it's also intersectionality. So it's really that's more of a learning approach, but I think that is the second insight, that you actually also need that kind of almost like a peer learning approach so that the sector is ready enough for the structures that you're trying to introduce to the market.
Yeah, I might actually follow up on that. That's a very interesting point. And you've talked about two very different examples, both in terms of scale and in terms of the structure. We've seen this play out in different types of deals and products. What are the enabling conditions for the type of deal that you would actually approach with saying, this is a good deal for us to think about a gender-linked structure? Is it based, and I'm sure it's a combination of this, but we'll love to think about IFC's approach in this. Is it a combination of, for example, the female participation rate in the country, given some of the countries you've provided examples of? Is it the type of investors coming into that particular investment? What are the different enablers that you consider to say, as different types of investors are in this room, when you're looking at an investment, which ones are the ones that you should consider introducing this kind of impact-linked incentives to?
Oh, you're really asking me the easy questions today. Look, the quick glib answer to that is it depends, obviously, but I'll try to get a little deeper into that. We have a mandate, right, to work on gender. It is a very strong mandate. We also have a certain position of influence in our ability to bring significant amounts of capital to the table. So we blend that, right, in order to do that. Now, having said that, I think there are certain sectors where it's a little easier for us to do that. So I think, we're able to do that. For example, I think 100% of our private equity fund investments over the last 3 years have had a gender component. Every single fund investment that we've made, at least in my region, which is South Asia, has had a significant gender component, which means it's not just I'm collecting gender disaggregated data, it's I will make sure that 30% of my portfolio companies will be focused on women-led services and consumer goods or whatever it is, right? So it varies. Other sectors which have worked very well for us are like financial inclusion. The sectors that are tougher have been the underserved sectors, like historically, and there are two pieces to it. The traditional sectors like infrastructure, you need to do this collation of the sector that I was referring to earlier, right? So in Nepal, for example, We brought together 18 hydropower companies because working with one hydropower investment was not going to achieve the kind of gender-focused impact we were looking at. So we had to approach it creatively. And I think the decision on the deal there was the opportunity for outsized influence in a market which we're looking at investing more in, and a sector that we're keen to kind of do more work in, right? So there's both those pieces to it. The other approach that we've used is in upcoming sectors. So to your point earlier, I think e-mobility, e-vehicles, these are sectors that we're tracking, we're excited to get into from an investment lens. And so we're deliberately thinking about how do we find deals, even if they're earlier size deals or smaller size deals than what we'd usually do, to then come in with a heavy gender lens and a heavy climate lens. So no easy answer. I think this is a much longer conversation, and it's a good question to ask. Something that I'll take away from here is to think about what might be the enabling pieces that actually work across all of our investments. We haven't really kind of done a strategic approach on that. We've been more opportunistic depending on the country and the market, but it's a great thing to think about.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll move on and give other people the option to answer to some of the difficult questions as well. So you've talked about origination, a little bit about deal structuring. Now it's really time to add value to companies. So Rajneesh, would love to come to you. And we've also talked a little bit about the gender-climate nexus, so in that lens as well. As a climate investor that takes operational control in companies, ESG, impact action plans we know are core to how you work with companies. How does gender inclusivity feature in these plans? And we know you work in sectors that sometimes have low representation of women, have historically had. So how do you see your role as an investor to drive and create value? And can you also bring this to life with maybe a couple of examples from your portfolio?
To make it simple, what we do is at the fund level, we draft the gender action plan. So these are all kind of companies which have been kind of, you can say, one-step build-outs from Eversource. Like we have got in some of the companies are 70 to 100% stake. And these are not like companies which were there in operation. So just to kind of bring the perspective, what these companies do is they adopt our ESGMS, our policies, and the gender action plan, and they build upon these plans. So that is how, just to give an example, at e-mobility sector, where we have our portfolio company Green Cell Mobility, which operates, as I speak today, around 1,027 electric buses across India. 700 in the business to government model in UP, remaining 300 across intercity services. Now, how do you kind of address the gender issues? Is it kind of limiting to only creating employment, or are we looking at a wider spectrum in terms of, you mentioned about climate gender nexus, that is where this comes into picture in terms of access to infrastructure, access to education. What kind of a safe space these buses provide in terms of reliable and safe transportation. And I give an example of the business to government model of Green Cell. In 14 cities, the intra-city service never existed. Now you have got an electric bus with 4 cameras in it, focusing on the passengers and giving you an update in terms of a command control center where the activities of the driver, the passenger footfall, everything is being monitored 24/7. And one thing I would like to emphasize is how does it impact? From the safety angle, these drivers are not allowed to carry a mobile phone. And that was a big challenge for a simple reason. People telling in this time, how can you stop us from using a mobile phone? We had put our foot down and said. So in terms of these situations, what we did is like, what is that the company could do in terms of bringing in more women into its operations? Now we have got 3 sections in this: the depot operations, the command control center, and the on-road, where actual drivers are there. On the depot side, still there are technical trades and non-technical trades. You can bring in women, but do you have the catchment is the state, right? You can't go beyond that. What did Green Cell do? They tried to scout the ITIs, tried to find, are there women who are pursuing these trades in electrical and mechanical? Can they be kind of engaged? Second, what they did is they reached out to the various NGOs in the state who were training women and looked for jobs compatible in this sector. Coming on to the on-road side, again, how do you deal with the larger community which boards the buses. And in UP, like in terms of discipline, it is, well, less said better. How do you deal with that? So what they found out is when there are transgenders, the people behave. They don't question. Now Green Cell is identified of around 10 to 15 transgenders which they intend to deploy in the operations when it comes to roll out on 500 buses in New Delhi. As I speak today, there are at least 4 women drivers operating in the Delhi-Agra route of Nugo brand of Green Cell, where these are the women drivers. They have got women cabin hosts, and there's one exclusive bus for women also. So that is the kind of, I would say, the baby steps the company has taken in terms of trying to address the gender issue. One thing I'd like to point out over is like only creating employment within the portfolio company, that is always going to be a challenge. As we speak today, roughly around out of the 2,500 odd employees in Green Cell, around 257 women are employed across various operations. I'm very proud to say that the depot manager in our Chennai depot is a lady, and she comes hard as nuts. Like, it is like you have to meet her to see how she manages it. So what happens is like, that's an entire ecosystem where right from the top leadership, this messaging has to go. Like you rightly mentioned, the intent has to be there, and the reach out that you need to have in terms of engaging with various NGOs, driver training schools, and also one aspect of it. How do you train these women if they want to become drivers? Do you hand over an electric bus immediately? No. Again, regulatory interventions are required. The way it works is in case of government tenders, what is happening is you have a driver with minimum 5 years of experience. Where do you get women driving a heavy vehicle with 5 years of experience? So that relaxation has to come. So Green Cell is engaging with the government in the various states, trying to bring down this requirement to say 1 year, where it's a mix of 4-wheeler experience followed by 3 months of bus driving experience along with the simulator training and then onboarding onto an electric bus. Because in terms of road safety, passenger response, plus the cost of the buses. A typical electric bus costs around 65 to 70 lakhs and to 1.2 crores. From that angle, what the company is trying to do is like identifying all the positions within the company and trying to see which are the roles where the women can fit in. You are also looking in terms of managing the command control centers and the customer service, where these girls are kind of monitoring these buses across the routes 24/7, and they're directing the drivers in case of any violation. It could be as simple as some driver trying to pop in tobacco in his mouth, or trying to eat something while driving, or when he starts yawning. So these are the kind of specialized training that needs to be imparted. So in terms of the institutional support, in terms of the training mix, there is much work to be done. So this is one example. Similarly, if I have got time, another one.
Maybe briefly, but it would be good to know.
So what becomes important is when you're talking in the waste sector, people say women are in large numbers, but you have to remember these are informal roles. But typically, So typically what happens is you see women as rack pickers, and these are the roles that people say, okay, that is employment, sorry. When I look at it from the perspective of giving safe, dignified livelihoods, we have to come up in the value chain. Where is it that coming? That role is coming once you are sorting, everything is done, and there is recyclable material, which can be further processed. How do you do that? Can you do it if you're just running a waste to energy plant or a renewable natural gas plant? No, because that is a technical aspect where you need trained manpower. What our portfolio company, Anwar, did is partnered with one NGO by the name Gulmeher. It's in Delhi only, where roughly around 500 women who were previously working in the waste energy plant were engaged in making handicrafts and other products. Now, in the past 1 year, these women are engaged in making these products. So we have to spread the net wider, look beyond roles and employment opportunities within the portfolio companies,
but also look at this linking that you can do with other opportunities that are coming in this sector.
Thanks, Rajni. Those examples are very inspiring. I think I've heard Green Cell's story many, many times, but it's still a story that when you hear it is inspiring because it's disrupting so many gender dynamics in the heartlands of India, and also at multiple levels, from the employment level on thinking about a different consideration for your recruitment bar to training to safety, and then also from the consumer angle on making it safe transport for women, especially intercity where we know sometimes there is a higher risk in terms of safety. So some great examples, and waste as well. We know a lot of majority waste workers in India, waste pickers, are women. So again, thinking about the safety and job quality aspects of those industries is very interesting and difficult to implement in practice. So thank you for those examples. I'd like to move on and ask you, Rajat. We've talked briefly, I think Shalaka mentioned the business case. I want to come back to the business case. I'm glad we're now at a point where we don't start with business case stats, which we would have done in this and similar forums a few years ago, but I think we're all bought in that there is a business case. But would love to understand really practically, have you found differences in performance between gender smart companies in your portfolio? And I'll let you to define how you've thought about that gender smart when you're looking at performance specifically. And if yes, what do you think contributes to those differences? And again, would love to hear some anecdotes bringing that to life. And I do want to acknowledge that we are talking about correlation here. It's not causation. So we're not saying because they're gender smart necessarily led to that, but those were kind of the enablers of success.
Sure. Look, the short answer to the very first part of the question is there correlation? Absolutely, yes. But it's easier said than proven, if you will. And a lot of us talked about the intentionality. I mean, we firmly believe that intentionality has to be coupled with accountability as well. And the way we put in that accountability is that, and that's kind of a broader definition of gender smart for us as well, because when you look at investing in any organization, it starts really with, first of all, when we assess the team for all the track record, I mean, their strength with respect to business, their core skills. We also check for alignment in terms of, and the point Jyotsna was mentioning earlier, that culturally how willing they are or how inclined they are to create diversity in the organization. So that's kind of very first step for us. And then that is followed by, when we decide to invest, the investment agreements, have some very specific gender clauses in terms of, what do they need to meet over our investment period from a gender target standpoint. And then, I mean, I talked about earlier with respect to certain gender disaggregated data that we collect. So, for example, if I give a lending company, I'll give example of a lending company. So, we just don't measure the loan portfolio. How much of the loan portfolio is for men, for women. Similarly, the default rate. From an internal employee standpoint, it is not just number of the women, but it is number of women at each level of the organization, especially the ones who are managing P&L. Their promotion rates of men versus women, the salary gap, so on and so forth. So just to state a couple of examples, in terms of the data that we have gleaned off of our portfolio over last many years. So we tried to plot each portfolio company with respect to increase in diversity against two parameters. So one was the increase in revenue and ROE, and second was the PAR. Now again, I think it might sound intuitive to all of us, when and it's kind of expected, that as the diversity increased, there was a remarkable growth in ROA. And the reason why we marked or plotted all the portfolio companies was to show that, the ones which did not make as much progress, where did they lie on that curve versus the ones that which did. But the point I'm trying to make here is, that when you show this to the portfolio companies, and one of the rights that we try and have in the investment agreements is that, this gender disaggregate data would not just be shown to the management team, but it will be presented to the board so that we have a broader stakeholder engagement. And through that, we put in, certain management incentives, KPIs in place, for the management to achieve, to the point I was raising about in accountability. Now, the couple of interesting things that have come out, two data points that I'll take an example. So in case of certain MSME based portfolios, it was a very clear trend that the average loan size for women was at least 20% lower than men. And when we put together that data with the default rates of women was much lower. So in isolation, I think, like I said earlier, everybody intuitively kind of gets that, that women are better performers, they're stickier in nature. When you put these data points together and show them that, look, these are your best performing customers, and yet you are lending, in a way that it is disadvantageous to them, I think then it sort of, starts clicking. Second example I would take again in case of MSME portfolio. And there was a Jin report which said that typically the average private equity investments reach around 18% of women as far as the MSME or women-owned MSMEs is concerned. And one of the reasons is a narrative that when it comes to MSMEs, the women are probably slightly worse customers. In fact, interestingly, we also saw that data initially, that the PAR levels when it came to MSME portfolio were slightly higher. So when we tried to unpack that, and we realized that it was not necessarily a problem with the clients, it was a problem with the selection criteria. Because the way the loan officer chose these clients, it was fairly homogeneous when it came to men and women. And there were certain nuances that were required in terms of their business development when reaching to women, because it takes more time to build a certain relationship. The trust has to be developed in a very different way versus if you reach a male client. So we took specific initiative and effort to conduct those training programs, and then we kind of observed that data again, and definitely the trend reversed. So what I'm trying to say is things might look in a certain direction when on the face of it, and that's how the narratives get built. And to the point around the unconscious bias as well. But the moment you start unpacking that data and looking sort of, peel the onion and look 3 layers below, and take specific initiatives, and results could be very different.
I think that's very interesting, and I think your anecdotes were really brought that to life. So thank you so much, Rajat, for that. I'm actually going to pose that same question to you, Rajneesh, because it's a very different sector. So I think with financial services, we have heard this data in the past. I think how you actually make that data very impactful with the business is something that was really interesting to bring out. I think the sectors you invest in is quite different. So I would love to understand from your perspective in infra, how does that actually work, and have you seen some of that play out?
So this is where like the technical assistance that we get from our investors helps. Like in case of both our e-mobility business as well as our waste management business, what we did is carried out a community benefit survey trying to identify how the larger community has benefited from the operations of these companies, whether it is in the e-mobility space or in the waste management space. So, and to be fair to these companies, most of them started their operations post-November 2021. And they have come to a stage where the operations are stabilized now. And this is where the stage at which these companies started really focusing on increasing the women percentage in the company. So at the corporate level, they have achieved all this. But when it comes to the plant level and the regional offices, they are trying to work upon that. How we measure that? Now that is like you have got a baseline data right now in terms of the total number of positions created in this company and where people have stuck to these positions. There has been a record of that the women have stayed in the company for more than a year. Now, like for example, Green Cell has decided that there will be 5% increase in the women intake by March 2025. So I am looking at something like another 15 to 20 women coming in the roles of Green Cell. Similarly, when it comes to lithium, the other company that we are working, it's our portfolio company, which has again got women drivers. There was reduction in the number of women drivers. Now, we try to analyze that, why is it that happening? So it so happens like they are being given posted to a particular client side, it's corporate employee transportation. Suddenly the number of car requirement goes down at the client side. And these women drivers are not ready to shift to other sites. They are not ready to go for other duties. There could be various reasons, timings, distance from the residence, all this thing comes in. So that is why we try to balance it out and see what other roles, alternative roles can be given. But again, given that space, it's limited. Like I can promote a driver to become a supervisor. She manages 10 to 15 drivers or maybe a larger hub. But then again, these are kind of roles that will come up as the business expands. I really can't fit them in right at the fact that she has resigned and she's no longer interested to take up any other role in the company. So these are the metrics that we keep on tracking and try to see how do we kind of create more inclusive jobs, or there are any opportunities where we can train them and engage. So these are again like specific examples where data helps in trying to understand what is the problem, what are the kind of amenities that they require. Very simple things like the mindset is such, you have employed 5 to 10 women drivers, but you don't have a washroom. What do? Then now all the depot plants of Green Cell have a separate washroom, whether there's one lady or there are going to be more to be recruited. So that has become as part of the design itself. So that is how the data is helping us in trying to track what are the additional benefits, and pay parity is another thing that comes up, but again, there are quite a few regulations in that because it's more of a, I would say, an aggregator model that it works upon. So, yeah.
All right, I think we're almost out of time. Do we have, okay, we don't have any more time at all. So if you have any questions, please find everyone outside to chat. But thank you so much. I think we've been able to bring a lot of what we've been talking about over the past couple of days to life through your various investments. So thank you for sharing your perspectives and for working in this space consistently. And thank you to IIC for hosting us and having this conversation.